I hope to persuade you of something that is relatively controversial, which is that despite the tragic and preventable death of George Floyd and before him Eric Garner and others whose names we don't know about, we have to teach and train the police in how to use chokeholds and other compression techniques effectively, which therefore means safely and ethically. Because despite whatever rules or laws we may pass, in violent physical confrontations, the police are going to have to know how to use these techniques to prevent harm to themselves, but also not to cause undue harm to others. I come to this conclusion after a journey that began over 20 years ago because of something that happened to me in 1997 in Chicago, a year after I graduated from Northwestern Law School. I was walking in a street fair with my girlfriend at the time, she had long dark hair, and I probably looked a lot paler than I do now. And as we were walking, she grabbed me by the hand, started pulling me across the street. Didn't know why. And next thing I knew, I was on the ground, a lot of pain in my face. I thought I'd been hit by a car because I was waking up next to one. But in fact, the crowd which was gathering was yelling at us and at me in particular, trying to tell us that I had just been attacked by a 20-something-year-old white male who took off his t-shirt, put a brick or some sort of object in it from behind and swirled it around, and it ended up hitting me in the front of the face, knocking me out. We actually gave chase with the help of the crowd, and the guy ran into a Chicago police officer, put him in handcuffs in the back of a squad car. And I went up to him and I said, "Why'd you do that?" And he said, "Because you're a white guy with a Mexican girl." And I remember telling him, I'm not white and she's not Mexican. And in fact, I'm the Mexican because my mom was born in Guadalajara and I'm a dual citizen. But the guy's name was Joe Chicago. That was his street name, and appropriately. And he had done this to 2 other people. He spent over 4 years in prison for what he did to me, and he was a self-declared Nazi. The effects at the time, were the physical effects went away. I mean, every few years I have to fix a front tooth, and that's annoying. But the mental effects were, I guess, longer lasting because they propelled the journey, which I'm going to describe to you now, which I actually really value. I think was a great trade-off in some respects, given how little I was ultimately injured. So when I got back to Phoenix, I started taking some self-defense classes just in case I needed to defend myself. And then I joined a kickboxing gym, and I learned how to do that. And then one day at the kickboxing gym, this average-looking guy kind of walks in, and he invites us to try something called jiu-jitsu, which I didn't even know how to spell or what it was. Jiu-jitsu is a martial art and a sport. It looks a lot like wrestling. It originated in Japan, made its way to Brazil, and then a very famous and big family called the Gracie family ended up disseminating it to instructors all throughout the world, including the United States. Jiu-jitsu starts on the feet like wrestling, but most of the action actually happens on the ground. It's called rolling on the ground. Because what jiu-jitsu uses is, for the most part, chokes around the neck or joint locks to submit or subdue, or tap is another way of calling it, an opponent. And you have to tap. You tap them on the arm or with a free hand, or you say the word tap loud to get the technique to be stopped so you don't get injured. And I think anybody who does jiu-jitsu for any length of time will remember their very first time trying it, because before then you probably had no idea how easy it was for somebody who was smaller and weaker than you to submit you and literally take your life from you. And so that began this journey for me into jiu-jitsu, which sort of is a 3-part journey. There's a physical aspect to it, which is learning all the moves and working with your body and seeing if you can do them or not. There's a mental part of the journey, which is that you have to learn to control your emotions, because under intense physical pressure, your heart rate goes up, your adrenaline goes up, you're scared, and then you don't do things the right way and you get very tired and you can lose a fight. In fact, that often happens. People who are mentally stronger beat the people who are physically stronger. And so learning to control the mental aspect is really important. Think of that, how that might apply to police officers under incredible physical stress and a very violent confrontation in which they may be armed. And then lastly, there's also, I would describe even a spiritual component of the journey, which is that in jiu-jitsu, you have to learn how to give up and how to humble yourself, because for the first year or so, you're constantly going to be tapped by smaller and weaker opponents, and you have to learn from them, to respect them, and to understand your own limitations and that kind of reality. And it's a wonderful journey. I'd encourage you to try it, but that's what it was for me. So one day at this jiu-jitsu gym I joined, some police officers came in, and a couple were members of the SWAT team. And these were like physically imposing people. And they tried it, and I got to roll with them, and I was able to bring them to the ground and choke them or tap them fairly easily. And I was really surprised. I was like, wow, I didn't know the police were this under-trained. I had just assumed, like most people, I think that they would have these like hand-to-hand physical skills and not just be reliant on their weapon, because what happens if they don't want to use their gun or they can't use their gun? What then, right? So they were like white belts on the street in that respect. And the white belts are the ones, in a jiu-jitsu academy who don't know very much. They're new to the class. And training can make a huge difference to these police officers. And let me give you an example of how training would make a difference using chokeholds, which unfortunately we've seen used to very terrible effect recently by police officers. There's a right way to do chokeholds and a wrong way to do chokeholds. And by the way, there's many different kinds of chokes. There's not just the ones we see. The news doesn't do very much justice to it. It's too detailed, but there's guillotine chokes, arm triangle chokes, and of course what's called the rear naked choke. And that's the choke I want to focus on for this example. So in an improper rear naked choke, I'm going to call it a trachea choke. The officer is like from behind, like remember Eric Garner? And he's like just putting pressure and yanking on the person's neck. And generally speaking, the blade of the officer's forearm is going to go against that person's trachea. You can see that their elbows kind of flared to at 90 degrees. And they're just putting pressure against the trachea. Now, a trachea choke is incredibly dangerous as well as mostly ineffective, right? You may be wondering how it can be both of those things at the same time. Well, it's because a trachea choke is only effective when it's incredibly dangerous. Other than that, it's not that good. And here's why. When you're putting pressure against a person's trachea, you can collapse their trachea, you can kill them, or you can damage their larynx, and they might not be able to speak. I mean, it's a really dangerous choke. But if the person is not already restrained, like if they have their hands free, they're going to panic and bump that arm and shuck and move and panic, and it's going to go off the trachea for a minute. And so the officer who's doing that kind of choke is going to probably just re-grab it and start yanking back again. And that person, by the way, who's resisting a trachea choke, even if they want to be compliant, cannot, because they're going to be so panicked and nervous and scared and in so much pain that they will automatically, reflexively be doing whatever they can, screaming, yelling, pleading, which we've seen, right, to have the officer release them from that pain and that danger, which is very real. So even if they want to be compliant, they can't. And the officer counterintuitively with no training is going to think, oh, this guy's resisting arrest, more choke. And then as they put the choke, even if they don't collapse the larynx, trachea or injure the larynx or whatever, they are choking the person, but sort of in fits and starts. And so if finally the person goes to sleep, that person may have built up like a very large oxygen deficit. And that could even cause them a heart attack or damage to their brain or whatever. It's a very dangerous way of choking somebody, but it's also kind of instinctive. You just grab and pull back. And that's what the lack of training is all about. Now, what would some training do? Well, in a proper rear naked choke, you wrap the arm completely around the neck. Now, I have very short arms, so this is hard to demonstrate, but you'll notice that the elbow is kind of pointed straight ahead, not to the side or down. And the blade of the forearm is now against one side of the neck, and the bicep, if I was behind this, would be up against the other side of the neck. And it puts pressure on the carotid arteries. And the carotid arteries are what carry oxygen to the brain. And when you stop the flow of that for even just a few seconds, 4, 5, 6 seconds, person goes to sleep. And then the better part is not only do they go to sleep, but then they wake up. And they wake up 10, 15, 20 seconds later, and they're totally fine. And you can put them in handcuffs or restraints. They'll be discombobulated, but they're okay. Even if you had to hold it for longer, it's, as long as you don't do it for like a minute, if you do it for 20 seconds or so, that person may wake up with a headache, but that's it. And in jiu-jitsu gyms, all the time this happens, right? People put this rear naked choke on, people go to sleep, they wake up. You learn not just to give it, but to receive it as well. So you know why people are doing what they're doing when they're being choked, and what's working and what isn't, what's dangerous and what isn't. This is what training can do. Now, just as a point, I don't think that if a person is in handcuffs that you should use a rear naked choke or any kind of choke. And I know people can still be non-compliant when they're restrained, but there's really no point at that point in actually choking them, right? And so like the George Floyd officers and the Eric Garner officers, you would know, had they done 6 months worth of training in jiu-jitsu, that they could never do that kind of thing. You can't put and restrict a person's breathing or choke their neck or put a knee in it or whatever for 8.5 minutes or whatever time it was. You would know that inherently, and you would have pushed the other person off, and you would have, you just know you can't do that. And so training makes a huge difference. I think that training, also would inspire confidence, because many officers, I think, are not confident in their hand-to-hand skills. And so without training, they're kind of in a binary choice. Do I rely on my untested physical skills, or do I go for my weapon? And I think this explains sometimes when we see police officers pull out their weapons in times when your person doesn't seem to even have a weapon. And I know they can have weapons hidden, but sometimes the person's like naked and drunk. It's kind of, you wonder why they're pulling out their weapon. It's because, well, the person could take their weapon and they may not have great confidence in their hand-to-hand skills to deal with this, lunatic who's coming at them. So more to the point, if we don't train officers, chokes are still going to happen. I mean, look at school kids fighting or people who are drunk fighting. They put each other in chokes. And if they're going to happen, we have to train police officers in how to use them. Now, the training in jiu-jitsu is not hard in the sense that it's available. There are jiu-jitsu gyms all around the country. They generally charge between $100 and $200 a month. It's not a fortune. We could pay for officers to go, and look at all the harm it would prevent. I think it's important that they go outside of their academies for training so that they learn to deal with the people in their community and get what that experience is like. The training cannot be just instructional, like it can't be just done by video, it can't be done like 20 hours on the mats, and that doesn't work. It needs to be, for several reasons, it takes 1 to 2 years, 2 or 3 times a week. You have to get the physical shape for it, and you also have to experience it. Now, some people might say, well, if you train people in jiu-jitsu, police officers in jiu-jitsu, you're going to make a racist or biased police officer more dangerous. First of all, if that officer is that way, they're dangerous with their gun. That's like the ultimate danger. But more to the point, it would also set us, like if you train them, you set them with a standard of care. So they can't excuse what they do because they didn't know that they were collapsing a person's lungs or suffocating while they talk back or whatever. So you'd set up a standard of care, and I think that's very important. Also, jiu-jitsu gyms have the advantage, especially if they're in the community, in that they're incredibly diverse places. They're almost like a Star Wars cantina of people. You will get people and you will roll with people who are older than you, different color than you, different ethnicity than you, don't speak the same language as you, different gender, right? Different sexual orientation, different political persuasion, different class. Jiu-jitsu gyms are like they're like the United States in that sense. Everybody goes to them, all different kinds of people, and you have to learn to work with them, and it's a beautiful experience. Now, somebody may say, well, other sports are diverse, like basketball and soccer and so on, and there's diversity there, but there's still also people who play them or watch them and are racist. Yes, that's true, but here's the difference. Jiu-jitsu has a degree of physical proximity and emotional intimacy that I just don't think is present in those other sports. Physically in jiu-jitsu, you are right next to a person. You are breathing their blood, sweat, and tears, literally, as you have this very close physical encounter that you're both agreeing to participate in. And we just don't get that kind of physical proximity, not just now in COVID, but even before. We're all in our screens. We're not close to people, and there's just something different about sharing an experience, whether it's a bonfire, whether it's whatever. Sharing something, a meal, sharing a physical experience with somebody in such close proximity creates a different kind of bond. It's hard to hate people as much, right? And then emotionally, it's a very intimate experience. And what do I mean by that? Well, in jiu-jitsu, when somebody releases you from a proper rear naked choke, they're not just scoring a point on you. They're giving you back your life, like literally. And when you release the choke on them, you're giving them back their lives. And this is going to happen many, many times over a week. And you connect with people on a different way by this shared experience that's physical and emotional. It really is a fantastic thing. Also, you develop these friendships. And yes, it's possible to go to jiu-jitsu class and be a racist and still have a black friend, but it's pretty hard to have many, many friends eventually from all different perspectives and colors and ethnic backgrounds and maintain a level of bias. And I think bias is maintained, to some extent because of lack of engagement. A last point I would make is that, when officers go on the mat, it kind of reveals your character. Because there are people who are too crazy and just get very upset or angry or cry or whatever, and they don't have composure. And jiu-jitsu weeds those people out. The person who's too aggressive, too angry, too upset, too temperamental. They leave gyms because they know they can't handle it. And I think jiu-jitsu in that respect could serve as a screening tool as well. It's an amazing sport, and it's something I think that if officers were exposed to, they'd be far less likely to use lethal force, and if they did have to use physical force, they wouldn't cause this undue harm to others. As Rickson Gracie, who was one of the founders of jiu-jitsu, said, he said, knowing jiu-jitsu is like being a shark in an ocean of fish, and the ground is your ocean. We need to train the police in how to use these techniques to prevent them from harming others, but also to protect themselves as well. It's a beautiful opportunity to get them to be diverse and explore the community and work with people and see them for who they really are. We can still train police in jiu-jitsu and do many other things. We can still reform the police departments, change the laws, give them other kinds of training. We can still do all the other things we might want to do, but let's take this opportunity to get the police the hand-to-hand physical training in jiu-jitsu academies, outside of the police departments, in their communities, so that they get in good shape, so that they learn how to defend themselves, so that they learn not to harm other people, and so that they know when to use proportionate physical force. It's just super important. And we should do this for ourselves, for the police, but also for the fabric of our nation. I hope you found this interesting, and I strongly encourage you to get there, find a local jiu-jitsu gym, and give it a chance, give it a try. You might defend yourself, make a lot of new friends, and have a great time.